Hello and welcome to The Hub. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. If you thought America went through its worst polarization during the Trump administration, think again. In President Joe Biden's second year in office, the issue of gun control and abortion became renewed sticking points, dividing the Americans. The Supreme Court of the United States' recent decision to scrap abortion rights has triggered fresh protests and set the state against the federal government, the conservatives against the liberals, and the abortion rights activists against anti-abortion campaigners. Where is this battle headed? Let's hear from the experts. I'm joined today by Bill Schneider, Professor of Policy, Government, and International Affairs at George Mason University in Virginia, and Rina Shah, political analyst and commentator. Welcome to both of you to the Hub on CGTN.
Thank you.
Hello.
Professor Schneider, let me start with you. To our audience in Asia and around the world who might not be terribly familiar with this whole Roe versus Wade thing, can you first of all explain to our viewers what was the 1973 landmark ruling on abortion, otherwise known as Roe versus Wade, was all about?
It was a big surprise when the ruling happened in 1973. That was almost 50 years ago. And it was a welcome surprise for a lot of women. It was consistent with many advances in civil rights and human rights that were passed in the United States in the 60s and 70s. But abortion had never been a major issue in the political debate in this country. The decision was based on the imputed right to privacy in the Constitution. There is no right to privacy written in the Constitution. It's not explicitly stated, but the Supreme Court said it was an implicit right. It often says things like that. And polling shows, if you ask most Americans, do you think there's a right to privacy in the Constitution? They say, yes, there is, but there really isn't.
All right, Rina, let's talk about the Roe versus Wade rule decisions 50 years ago. A rule that pregnant women were entitled to an abortion during the first 3 months of their pregnancy, while allowing for illegal restrictions and bans in the second and third trimesters. In what way do you think did this 1973 ruling change women's rights?
I'm somebody who was born after 1981, so I'm considered a millennial. But that ruling, I can say is very safely, to me, as a woman who was born and raised in the United States, sort of put into place a precedent that we never thought could be overturned. And that sounds rather naive, but it felt as if the right to terminate a pregnancy was just something that was part and parcel with how modern American women sort of saw their reproductive access, their rights, and that there was no danger to it. Of course, now we know that upwards of some 60-some Americans did not want to see Roe versus Wade overturned. And so this overturn was something that was not only not in line with American public opinion, but was something that really made American women energized about what privacy is, what liberty and freedom mean to them. Now, one interesting fact about Roe versus Wade is that, yes, it was such a landmark decision in 1973. But if you fast forward to even just the fall of last year, I can tell you, we learned then when this was sort of coming to fruition, in a sense that maybe the court may do this. We learned that 58% of US women of reproductive age, that's 40 million women, already live in states that are hostile to abortion rights. That's very important. So I think American women now in this moment know that Roe versus Wade is no longer the law of the land, so to speak, but it is a decision that has made them realize that we have to get hyper local. We need to understand what our rights are state by state, because now, based on who's in power in your state, you certainly have the ability to either terminate your pregnancy or you will have to perhaps possibly cross state lines. That is something that is not banned federally.
Yeah, Rina, let me stay with that question. Let's say, very realistically, if a woman lives in a conservative state, such as Tennessee or Mississippi, and right now she wants an abortion. But in that state or states, abortion was made illegal. How can that woman really have, the option, if any, to have an abortion?
Yeah. Right now, there are many groups who are mobilized right now to help out women who are in distress in that way, who perhaps need to terminate a pregnancy because of medical reasons. We've just learned of a case in Ohio just yesterday of a 10-year-old girl. Now, we don't know that much about it. So I'll just say that this young girl is 10 years old and needs an abortion. And the judge has said, No, frankly. But we've also learned from Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker, a Republican, who is saying he's not going to take part in something like an extradition. If a woman crosses state lines to come to a state to seek an abortion, he will not extradite her and have her face criminal charges, for example. Now, in Texas, Attorney General there is saying that they are trying to seek all kinds of avenues to even punish corporations, individual private companies that try to help women access abortion and reproductive care.
Mr. Schneider, do you have anything to add? How does this work in reality?
But in reality, the answer to your question is if this young woman gets pregnant and seeks an abortion in a state like Tennessee, it would be a criminal act. She could be prosecuted. Many district attorneys who are responsible for criminal charges say they would never prostitute a person like that. But legally, it is now possible. The most dramatic thing about that Supreme Court decision is that what they did was they threw away precedent. The 1973 decision established a precedent. It said abortion rights are a constitutionally guaranteed right, and they were on the books for 50 years. So the Supreme Court last month said, forget it. We no longer think it's a valid law. That was shocking to Americans and surprising to a lot of lawyers and a lot of people who follow the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court just threw out a precedent without really any explanation, except we think that decision was wrongly decided. That was revolutionary.
Bill, let's stay with that question because we know that in the United States of America, states have considerable power when it comes to making their own laws, especially when it comes to abortion, perhaps. To what extent do you think the states and the state lawyers and executors, people in the executive branch, are obliged to follow this Supreme Court decision to ban abortion?
We don't really know. We don't know how much leeway they're going to have. A lot of them have been saying that they have no intention of prosecuting women who seek abortions if there's a valid reason for it. And they're not going to give them, they're not going to issue criminal charges. Now, there are many states like Massachusetts, New York, California, where abortion is by state law legal. And there wouldn't be any criminal prosecution in those states in any case, because the Supreme Court said we're going to leave it up to the states. But about half of Americans live in states that have already made abortion illegal. The question is, will prosecutors in those states actually go after women who seek abortions, particularly if they have a defensible reason for seeking an abortion? Let me tell you, I've studied public opinion on abortion for over 50 years, since the ruling was issued in 1973. Americans make one clear distinction. They believe it should be legal to have an abortion if the woman is the victim of rape or incest, if it's a threat to the life or health of the mother, if the child is likely to have a significant birth defect, then it should be legal. When should it not be legal? If the couple doesn't have enough money to raise a child, if she doesn't want any more children, if she doesn't want to get married. What people are saying in those polls, and they've never changed, is abortion should not be used as a form of birth control, but it should be available when it's necessary in cases like rape or incest or the threat to the life or health of the mother. It should be available under those kinds of situations when it's a necessity, but Americans do not like the idea that it should be a form of birth control.
Rina, in the week since the Supreme Court overturned Roe, litigators for abortion rights groups rolled out a wave of lawsuits in nearly a dozen states in the United States to hold off bans on abortion. They say state constitutions do establish a right to abortion that the Supreme Court says they do not. Where do you foresee the state versus federal government's battle headed?
We have to see this for what it is. It is a tough situation when that tension between federal and state government. Now, that anti-abortion advocates say, we don't understand why all of you who are upset about the overturn of Roe versus Wade are so upset. All this did is put the power back to the states. And I say this, is that it should not matter what zip code a woman lives in for her to have a right to do what she wants to do with her body. I've come to understand abortion as somebody looking at the issue through the lens of democracy. I genuinely feel that if a woman doesn't have bodily autonomy then is she even a full citizen in this democracy? Unless she has the full political, economic, and social rights that males do, then a woman is just simply put a second-class citizen. It's important to sort of look at all the sort of facets of the moment. We have two justices, Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, who during their confirmation hearings said that they would not overturn precedent. And there are people now who are so angry that they say they want to, charge these justices somehow with perjury for lying under oath during their confirmation hearings. So what does codify mean? To codify something means to arrange laws or rules into a systemic code, essentially, right? If that's done with Roe versus Wade, then that federal law would supersede any anti-abortion laws that are passed by state legislatures. That's really important because the vast majority of American women, again, want it so protected, the right to do something with their body that should not be a decision between anyone else, except for the woman, the person she's procreated with, and her doctor. That's my opinion. And Republicans used to really believe in this too, that the relationship between a patient and a doctor was so sacred. So this moment is all about privacy, again, liberty and freedom. But to me, one thing is really huge, and why I personally believe that Roe versus Wade should be codified is because of bodily autonomy. We can't leave it up to the states. It is very, very important, I believe, for President Biden and members of Congress to put their heads together and figure out what to do to protect that right for American women to do what they want to do with their bodies.
Yeah, I mean, I live in Asia. I can tell you for a fact that a lot of the East Asian countries, at least, provide women with the option of having an abortion if she opts to do so. So, Bill, how has Roe versus Wade been overturned? Give us some background here. What was the trigger, let's say, nearly half a century after the ruling?
Well, the trigger was Trump. When he got elected, he did something that Republican presidents before him, namely Ronald Reagan, promised to do, George W. Bush promised to do. They've all said that they wanted to change Roe versus Wade. They didn't do it. And a lot of Republicans were grateful that they didn't because they thought there'd be a huge backlash. And there is. But Trump got in office and he was a much more radical conservative than any of them. And he did it. The radical right, whom he brought to power in the United States, he empowered the radical right. They've been around for 200 years, but he put them in positions of power. He did what they wanted, and they are eternally grateful to him. They want to see him elected president again, because what Trump did was what most presidents, including Biden, did not do. He delivered. He delivered what he said he would do. He said that he would get rid of he would end the legal right to abortion. He appointed 3 justices to the Supreme Court, all of them, of course, conservatives, and they all did his bidding, which was to invalidate Roe v. Wade. So he is a hero to the radical right, but to most Americans, he took away a fundamental freedom.
Right. I want to talk about public opinion in the United States. A recent Pew research in March found that 61% of Americans say abortions should be legal in all or most of the circumstances. Yet, we all know that the Supreme Court still made the decision to overturn Roe versus Wade. I want to ask both of you, how do you feel about this reality, where some 8 or 9 unelected judges make what many consider one of the most important decisions concerning a woman's health against the wishes of the majority of the country? Bill, let me start with you.
Oh, well, the decision is not popular. People think a fundamental freedom has been taken away from them. And you've got to understand that the division over abortion is a very clear fundamental division in ideology. It is based on religion. Opposition to abortion and to the Roe decision was always based on religion. Observant Catholics and evangelical Protestants do not accept a woman's right to have an abortion. Religious Christians, who are a large number in the United States, they've been protesting the Roe decision for 50 years. Every January, on the anniversary of the Roe decision, they come to Washington and have a big protest march. The United States is unusual. It is the most religious, advanced industrial society in the world. For most countries, the wealthier and better educated the country, the less religious it is. The United States is the great exception. We are by far the wealthiest and the best educated country in the world, but we're also the most religious industrial country. Belief in God, in the devil, in angels, in heaven, in hell, church attendance. They're all higher in the United States than in any other country in Europe, Canada, the rest of the world. Why? Because a lot of people came to the United States in search of religious freedom in the first 2 centuries, even the 20th century. That's why the Puritans came over on the Mayflower in 1620, because they felt oppressed by the Church of England. Jews came to the United States fleeing persecution in the Soviet Union in the 20th century. Views on abortion are strongly influenced by religion, specifically religiosity, which means how often you go to church, not just what your religion is, but how religious you are. And Americans are measurably more religious than people in any country. Let me tell you a little story. I once interviewed a Catholic bishop. The church, as you know, is opposed to abortion. And he gave me the following example, and I was kind of flummoxed. I didn't know what to say. He said, our church, the Catholic Church, regards abortion in the same way we regard human slavery. You cannot say, I'm opposed to slavery and I personally would never have a slave. But if you want to go out and buy yourself a slave, by all means, it's your right, go ahead and do it. We cannot allow that, he said. We feel the same way about abortion. You can't say, I'm opposed to abortion and I would never allow it to happen under my authority. But if you want to go out and have an abortion, go ahead and do it. He said, we consider it as saying the same as saying, if you want to go out and buy yourself a slave, go buy yourself a slave. It's your right. That's the position of the church, the Catholic Church. That's the official position. And that's the position of many, many Americans.
That's how far they would go, huh? Rina, what do you think?
You know, I have made my career on the right in an era where, again, nobody really thought Roe versus Wade would be overturned. I, in 2008, worked for a member of Congress who that year happened to be the only member of Congress that was still anti-abortion in the case of incest or rape. So 2008 to now, look, it's a moment where I have heard the arguments from those who are against abortion. They say that from conception onwards, the developing fetus has a future like ours, and that abortion takes that future away. I'm a mother to 3 children myself. I never at the 6-week mark, for example, did I know that I was actually expecting. Many states are talking about earlier and earlier bans. What I think is really important here is for people to understand the rights of the person who is carrying that fetus. And if that person needed an abortion, if it's medically necessary, say they have an ectopic pregnancy, why would we ever want that decision to be made by the state? And I think that is something that I have tried to appeal to many Republicans in this era with, because I've been anti-abortion for myself as a religious person, but I've always been pro-choice for other women because I believe that they have to answer to their own God. Or they may not believe in God, and that is okay too, because here in the United States, we have separation of church and state. And I thought it unfathomable that somebody could govern with their holy book. So the religiosity that Mr. Schneider talks about, it's permeated our lives in such a way. It's shocking. I was on the campaign trail in 2016 when I heard many Republicans in the Western states who frankly didn't like Mr. Trump when he was a candidate, saying, but I'm going to hold my nose and vote for him anyway because I want conservative justices. And I heard that also in the Mid-Atlantic region and the southern states. So here they were willing to take a candidate that they did not particularly like, that they felt was very flawed. Some of them would even appeal sort of these religious tropes about it, sort of say he's chosen by God and he's imperfect, but we're all imperfect. That was very jarring to me because I always thought the Republican Party was a home for freedom above everything else, and that these lawmakers could be trusted not to govern with their holy books. When I saw Roe overturned by the Supreme Court, there's nothing else I could see there than that naked sort of, seeking to govern with their holy books by justices who did not dissent.
Bill, let me go to you. I want to ask you about the underlying forces that made this Supreme Court ruling possible. We know this is, the overturning of Roe versus Wade was somewhat a political victory accomplished by lobbyists, strategists, and campaign professionals in the Beltway area. Can you talk to us about how those forces worked behind the scenes to eventually push the Supreme Court or at least exert influence on the Supreme Court to overturn Roe versus Wade?
The answer is intensity. You can't just measure public opinion by looking at numbers on a poll, because you have to find out whether it's such an important issue that it drives people's votes. And the issue of guns, gun owners are a minority in the United States, are only about 30 to 40% of Americans, but they vote the issue. You threaten their gun rights, they're going to come out and vote against you, and they don't want to know anything else except that you're threatening their gun rights. Anti-abortion people are a minority, but they vote the same way. If you are pro-abortion rights, they're going to vote against you. And that's the message that politicians get. They're going to lose a lot of votes if they come out for abortion rights. So therefore, what most politicians say is, we're just not going to talk about it, because we can only lose votes because the country is so deeply polarized around this issue and around many other issues. And we've been polarized around issues like that for well over 50 years, since the 1960s.
What do you think this Supreme Court decision will do to the political future of the Republican Party versus Democratic Party? We know that midterm elections are on the horizon. What will this decision mean for the political landscape of the United States in the future?
Much depends on what Trump decides to do. The current news is that he may decide to declare himself a candidate for president for the third time in 2024, and he may do that within the next few months before the midterm election, in which case the whole midterm election will be about him. Republicans worry about that because they say, wait a minute, a lot of people don't like Trump. You know who the two most unpopular figures are in American politics right now? One, Donald Trump. Two, Joe Biden. Won't that be a wonderful election between the two most unpopular figures in American politics? If he runs, it'll be, the abortion issue will be hung around his neck, and I don't think it'll be successful for him.
Rina, who's the political winner coming out of this overturning of Roe versus Wade?
Well, it's certainly Democrats. I mean, how could they not want to mobilize their electorate with this news that, look, the Republicans have succeeded. They didn't just tell you what they were going to do. They showed you, and it's done now. And if you don't show up for us, then you may have all your rights taken from you. And of course, we know that Justice Clarence Thomas, in this decision of overturning Roe v. Wade, he even hinted at what else could be overturned. Gay rights as well. People are feeling pain at the pump in a way that they haven't ever felt. And the sticker shock when you go to the grocery store for your basic daily commodities, especially for young parents like me who have these needs. And let's not forget, there was a baby formula shortage that only just now got better this month. And I gave birth during the midst of that just 2 months ago. And look, you can put everything on one person.
Right.
But that's not fair. But I think that the people who really watch Washington know that the Biden administration has failed in some fronts. It hasn't delivered in the way that many even Democrats had expected they would. So there was this feeling of sort of, do we show up in the midterms? Generally, voter turnout is lower in the midterms anyway. It is going to be about how Democrats message. They're certainly on the winning end of this, but they have to go for the jugular in their messaging leading up to November, to these midterms. They have to make the case. They have to go beyond the overturn of Roe v. Wade and say, you can trust us. You can trust us to make sure your rights remain intact, and that we don't go through the feelings that we've just experienced in the aftermath of the overturn of Roe versus Wade.
Many say that next in line is New York Times versus Sullivan, a 1964 ruling that restricts the ability of American public officials to sue for defamation. Do you think this is in line next? Do you think this will happen eventually?
Well, given this court, we don't know what they're going to do, but they could easily do that. They could easily rule against the New York Times and against the press. Remember, the press is considered the congenital enemy by conservatives, and this is a very conservative court, 6-3. Those justices who voted to overturn Roe v. Wade really have roots in the radical right. And the press is the enemy of conservatives. They're constantly in an uproar against the press. So yeah, that decision could be in line. There are many others that could be in line as well, like
for example,
same-sex marriage. Clarence Thomas mentioned that. The court said same-sex marriage is a human right. It should be allowed as the law of the land. It now is. But if they overturn the precedent in Roe v. Wade, they can turn around and say, no, we think that was a mistake. we're not going to allow same-sex marriage anymore, or we're going to say it's up to the states, in which case a couple can be married in New York and not married in Tennessee. I mean, it'll be a ridiculous situation. Human rights are involved with abortion and with same-sex marriage. And the idea that the Democrats want to impose or impress people with is human rights can't be dependent on where you live.
Rina, what do you think can the liberals or the Democrats do at this point? Because after all, there are 6 versus 3 conservative versus liberal judges at the Supreme Court, and this reality may not change anytime soon.
Well, they can work to end the filibuster. President Biden has indicated that this past week. Just a couple of days prior, his Vice President Kamala Harris grew exasperated in an interview with a member of our national press here and said, "We don't have the votes." So why would you even ask the question when we don't have the votes to end the filibuster? I think Democrats certainly on a national level are looking a bit disorganized here. And that's frustrating for many of us who, for example, I personally have crossed party lines to vote for Democrats, though I was a lifelong registered Republican. I think the ideal voter in a democracy votes on the issues, not along party lines. So, if you want to try to appeal to these people, the growing sort of independent in the United States, the growing majority of us who feel sort of politically homeless, or who have for a very long time also felt very centrist and moderate. It's hard to know where to look for leadership, because again, in the same week, you're hearing 2 different messages. And it also makes you wonder that how really ready are they to do, again, what would be considered sort of this nuclear option?
Can I point something out?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Bill.
I just wanted to say, if they succeed by some miracle in ending the filibuster in this Congress, and then Republicans gain a majority in the Senate this year in November in the midterm election, Democrats will regret ending the filibuster, because they will suddenly be in the minority, and the Republican majority will say, hey, the filibuster is no longer a rule. We can vote with a simple numerical majority for anything we want. And they will. So it's something that Democrats have to think about very, very carefully.
Maybe they can wait until the midterm to do anything on this filibuster side. Thank you very much, Bill Schneider and Rina Shah, for coming to our show, The Hub on CGTN. Great to have you with us. Come back again. It's great to talk with you both.
Thank you.
All right. I'd also want to thank our viewers for tuning in to The Hub on CGTN. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. Thank you for watching.